All right, we've talked in the past about other sites and other locations. I don't think that's Chinese paintwork. I mean, it might be. But anyway, um, the so let's start again. News came out last night of an incident between a Royal Australian aircraft P-8 Poseidon on patrol in the South China Sea and a Chinese fighter jet that punched out a bunch of flares in close proximity to the aircraft. Now, when we talked about the airspace incursions in Europe, that everybody's getting all upset and yelling and screaming and demanding the Russians be hung, drawn and quartered for. Well, this is how you deal with an incident like this. Not demanding what's going on in Europe, but the initial political, hey, you shouldn't have done that, as opposed to, we don't hear Australia rushing to demand China's aircraft are shot down or anything like that. I mean, China may rattle sabres as well, but so what happened was, okay, P-8 Poseidon on patrol in the South China Sea. South China Sea is obviously full of places that are contested, such as the Spratlys, just trying to think, Henderson Shoal, I think, is one of them as well. Yeah, but basically there's a bunch of low-lying reefs and islands, and their nature and which nation claims them. Now, we talked at length about what defines territorial waters and things like that, and how you define baselines was very briefly glossed over. But talking about land permanently above the high water mark, part of the issue here is that a lot of these islands and reefs are not permanently above the high water mark. So, under the conventions for laws of the sea, they're not classed as permanent terrain. However, China has created artificial islands in some locations and plonked military bases down on them. In others, the Philippines in particular have basically put a detachment of troops aboard a shipwreck that's sitting on a reef and using that to lay claim to territory in that regard. And then you have various navies and coast guard, and it's going at each other in generally non-violent terms, but the Chinese Coast Guard and the Philippines Navy, I believe, had a clash a month or so back, where the two vessels came together at sea. The Chinese Coast Guard vessel was more heavily damaged, and I think a couple of sailors died in the incident. And I mean, this sort of stuff goes on. You see it as well. You see these sort of low-level violent clashes taking place in other locations where there's contested terrain, such as islands that both South Korea and Japan claim, places where China has claims and other nations like, no, you don't. And the idea that all this stuff's without, like, there's no conflict going over it, well, it's always been simmering. No one's shooting each other yet, but that's the concern, that at some point the tensions around these areas are going to lead to a shooting war. Now, you've got the Philippines, you've got Vietnam, you've got some places, but potentially Thailand as well, but it's a little bit out of their reach. Malaysia in some areas, but in terms of the South China Sea more specifically, the main participants, or the main people laying claim, Vietnam, Philippines and China. Now, China's using their 9-dash line to secure claim over these reefs and islands, even though it's like, people look at it and go, no, that's too far from Chinese territory. your claims are not worth it, not worth the paper they're written on. And Vietnam and Philippines, though, but the problem is neither of those two countries have the military might to enforce their will in those regions. Now, it's always been, so like I said, a bunch of disagreements. Most people are in there fishing and doing whatever anyway, but it's since the Chinese have militarized a lot of these places that, all of a sudden, the rules aren't changing, but the enforceability is, and the enforcement is. And we go back to those discussions about rights of free passage and transit navigation and innocent passage and things like that. So rights of free navigation. That is why, well, the US is continually forcing it, and the same with the Formosa Strait, or the Taiwan Strait. And you've got Australia partaking in these sort of things as well, forcing their rights of free navigation through the area. Again, because if you don't use it, you lose it. And with that comes aircraft usage, and they follow the same basic rules as we discussed. So as far as Australia is concerned, they're entitled to conduct surveillance flights through this area because it's in line with international law. Quite obviously, China has a different viewpoint on that and have established various military and Coast Guard elements to support or otherwise. And so in this case, there was an Su-35 that has basically come and flown up to the Australian Poseidon and released flares in its vicinity. All right, now you come down to questions about hostile act versus hostile intent. The firing of flares in such a manner could be declared or could be determined a hostile act. It's quite obviously meant as a deterrence. It's also potentially a hostile intent. Now, if you're going to talk about procedures for air intercepts, each nation will have their own rules on that, but there are in general some very basic rules which are also fairly similar to intercepting vessels at sea or patrolling around them. And the idea of being able to fire flares is kind of a long way down the path, a long way down the list in the escalation levels, and so a long way down the list in terms of the intercepts, and represents an escalation of what's going on. And same with the manoeuvring of intercepts and things like that. You want to keep maneuvers of the intercepting aircraft and the intercepted aircraft to a minimum so as not to upset the situation or unnecessarily antagonize things. And these things have been around for, well, decades. I mean, they were doing it all the time during the Cold War. They still do it all the time now. But it doesn't always end safely. April 2001, a US Navy EP-3 Ares, EP-3-2, I think, Ares. So that's an intel gathering variant of the P-3 Orion. Was doing a surveillance patrol along off Hainan Island when, and I think it was a J7, a Chinese J7 was sent out to intercept. And apparently the pilot flying the J7 at the time was one that the US Navy crew recognized. Is a fairly common sight, this particular pilot and his aircraft on intercepts in that area. So it wasn't a case of they'd not seen him before. But the US crew had sort of their doubts about this guy's aircraft handling, that he was always fairly aggressive in his maneuvers, when generally you just want, confirm what they are or who they are and encourage them to leave. And this is the US flying up and down outside the 12-mile limit. It's fairly antagonistic, but hey, they're there. They're entitled to do it. In the Hainan incident, what happened what is believed to have happened based on the investigations and everything else is that the J7 ended up crossing the nose of the P3, of the EP3, and hit it. And as a result, the J7 crashed and the pilot was killed, as far as I'm aware. And the EP3 suffered serious damage to the point that they also nearly crashed, but were forced to carry out an emergency landing in Hainan. And so the Chinese now had this, well, they were quite irate. Things were very, very, very sensitive for a while. They ended up releasing or allowing the P3 to be flown out after it had been dismantled and put inside, I think it was a C5, came and picked it up. And the crew were eventually released. But yeah, there was a lot of very urgent high-level diplomacy that took place. And ultimately, whilst China were annoyed at the loss of their pilot and aircraft, fundamentally, the Chinese pilot had been in the wrong. The US aircraft was entitled to be there, and whilst China can complain about it legally, and I mean, fundamentally, you back up your complaints with military force, they weren't going to stop the US at that point. And then a few months later, something else happened and took all the focus away from those sort of events. And, I mean, people were, yeah, it was a big incident there for a while. So, you've come back to today. It's not the first time, I mean, we talk about, being safe around things like that. I mean, naval vessels being intercepted will occasionally fire, like in the past, fired flares at aircraft on patrol and things like that. It's not the first time this sort of thing happens. In general, people are, a bit antagonistic. It's the same as looking at fire control radars and things like that. If you're going to energize a radar, an air search radar or a nav radar will generally be accepted, but a fire control radar is, no, not so much, because that's used for terminal direction or direction of weapons. And whereas an air search radar is just, filling out the picture of who's who in the zoo. So but firing flares is seen as a bit of a step up. So China's alleged that Australia illegally intruded into China's airspace. Okay, so you go back to this 9-line limit, and the fact China's now trying to enforce the airspace and water space around these artificial islands as their sovereign territory. No one else is really regarding it as such. And so China, as far as China's concerned, is like, no, you guys were in our territory. We are entitled to force you out. The rest of the world's going, it's not your territory. We have a right to be there. And so at some point, there's going to be push comes to shove, and someone's going to do something over it. Hopefully not too much about it, but it's been a fear for decades that this region of the world is going to erupt into conflict because of the competing claims and the natural resources that go with the ability to enforce those claims. So, China's obviously getting upset about it, and Australia's responded, it's like, no. We expect everyone to be in a safe and professional manner. The fact the aircraft got intercepted, okay, that's one of those things that happens. But, I mean, this little paragraph gives it as it's a region where China's claims overlap those of their neighbours, and obviously it's a concern. Apparently it happened previously in February, and that the same sort of claim was made then. And Australia doesn't have a territorial claim, but they're exercising their rights of access. So And yep, it's happened previously. So it's one of those things. We may see it happen more and more as we go forward.